Halo Combat Evolved releases in 2001 and is a huge success, selling 3 million copies and putting Xbox on the map. Microsoft finally saw this as a possible franchise and immediately greenlit extra material to be made alongside the video games, and also greenlit Halo 2's development as well. Microsoft got Eric Nylund, author of the previous book Halo: The Fall of Reach, was brought back in to write another Halo book for the franchise. And this wasn't going to be like any other Halo book. This was going to be an important Halo book answering many important questions. Questions that many fans had while playing Halo 1 and also experiencing the events of Halo 2 were simply, how did the Master Chief and Cortana get back to Earth? Or how did Avery Johnson survive the Flood? And many other questions that would eventually be answered in the 2003 book by Eric Nylund, Halo: First Strike. Releasing in December of 2003, Halo: First Strike as a book was designed to be the gap between Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 2, tiding fans over by explaining events between the two games and also answering many questions that the fans asked about the franchise. But being released so long ago, does Halo: First Strike honestly hold up as a media that explains between 1 and 2 the video game's lore, but also holding up as its own individual story? Well, before we get into my opinions about the book, let's talk about the plot and what exactly happened in the book first. Taking place after the events of Halo 1, we see Cortana and Chief fly through the debris of the once Halo ring. We also find out that they pick up a few passengers along the way. They pick up Fel, Spartan, and Linda. They also pick up Corporal Locklear, Warrant Officer Shin Pulaski, Lieutenant Haverson, and of course Avery Johnson. Together the group decides to hijack the Covenant ship Ascendant Justice and eventually fly to Reach, picking up a few more passengers including Fred, Kelly, and Dr. Halsey. Eventually the group decides to leave the planet Reach and eventually engage in a slip-space battle with Covenant cruisers, eventually defeating them and landing inside an asteroid city. After arriving at the city, John learns two truths about the situation going on. The first thing he learns is Dr. Halsey tells John the reason why Johnson survived the Flood in the first place was because he had a special syndrome called Bohr's syndrome. And he was actually in the process of treating the disease with chemotherapy until it was postponed. This in turn created Johnson with a disrupted nervous system, which allowed him to survive the Flood since the Flood needed a nervous system to attach and consume the body. After learning the truth, Dr. Halsey gives John a choice, two crystals so to speak. One presents information about Johnson's condition and how he avoided the Flood, while the other presents the same information, but this time around it mentions Johnson by name, which in turn would probably most likely lead to Johnson's death. Dr. Halsey leaves it up to John to which crystal he would choose and give to Oni. Shortly after this too, John also learns the fact that the Covenant have found the location of Earth and are amassing a gigantic armada. But before they can set up a plan for this, the Covenant attack the city that they're staying at. Dr. Halsey takes Spartan Kelly and leaves for an unknown destination, while John and the other Spartans and Ascendant Justice, alongside with the Gettysburg attached to the ship, leave the city before the Covenant can destroy the city. Shortly after this, John and the other Spartans, alongside with the crew of the Ascendant Justice / Gettysburg, would get together to form a plan against the amassing armada headed for Earth. This would eventually become Operation First Strike. Slipping into defeat using the Spirit, John, Fred, and Linda and others slip into the command ship of the armada, the Unyielding Hierophant. Designed as a figure 8 in design, they reach the ship's reactors and blow up the ship, causing a massive explosion. Realizing this, Admiral Whitcomb and Lieutenant Haverson aboard the Ascendant Justice distracts the rest of the Covenant fleet towards their location and eventually blow up the ship, causing the rest of the fleet pretty much to be annihilated. Completing the mission, John, Cortana, Johnson, and others aboard the Gettysburg and finally head back to Earth. John eventually chooses the crystal that saves Johnson's life and destroys the other, realizing that every life is of value. And eventually they all head back to Earth, and just in time for the events of Halo 2. So, that was the plot of Halo: First Strike. And how is the book as a whole? Well, I personally think it's pretty good. My biggest praise of this book is honestly how it explains events between Halo 1 and 2 and fills up many of the gaps and answers many of the questions that many players might have had when playing Halo 2's events between 1 and 2. It explains how Chief got back to Earth in time for Halo 2. It explains how Johnson was not affected by the Flood and also how he came back to Earth as well. It also explains how Chief and Johnson have more of a close relationship that was not seen in Halo Combat Evolved but is seen in Halo 2, which makes a lot more sense
reading the book since these two characters do spend some time talking to each other and getting familiar with one another. Also, the opening attack by the Covenant on the city of New Mombasa at the very beginning of Halo 2 also makes a lot more sense since, well, the giant Covenant armada that was intended for the invasion of Earth was destroyed in First Strike. So that's why in Halo 2 there's such a small fleet invading the planet, because most of it was destroyed in the events of First Strike, answering some questions there.
Not only explaining the events between 1 and 2, the book also picks up storylines from the Fall of Reach that Eric Nylund established, picking up themes from the Battle of Reach and establishing more of what happened on the planet and what exactly went down. It's pretty awesome and pretty interesting on its own way. Another huge positive that I like about this book is the fact that this book has a central theme this time around. Unlike Halo Fall of Reach would lack the central theme, this book's central theme is around a moral dilemma about the value of life. Dr. Halsey gives John 2 crystals that will decide Johnson's fate in the franchise. One will kill him and one will save him, and Master Chief has to choose which one to give to Oni. Eventually he decides to give the one that will save Johnson's life, and learning about the value of life, and learning the fact that every life is important. The book also shows many other great themes throughout the story, and also shows different motivations and characters that grow throughout the story. Dr. Halsey goes through a transformation of her own, from a cold, disillusioned scientist to someone who becomes more humane by the end. And also Master Chief learning the value of life. All these characters show complexity, and they also show change, which I really like about this book. Also, this book features some kick-ass action sequences, like Whitcomb's sacrifice at the end, the huge Armada sequence at the very end of the book. Honestly, I don't really have many gripes with Halo First Strike. I think it's a pretty good book overall, and most of the gripes I do have are really just grievances. As I said before, everything is not perfect, and I do think Cortana's struggle with the Halo data was an interesting subplot, but honestly pointless in the overall Halo universe. Overall, Halo First Strike is a great book. It's a much better follow-up to Nylund's previous Halo book. It gives the universe more expanded lore, a great central story, and central themes in the Halo story. It also perfectly fills the gap and answers many questions between the events of Halo 1 and Halo 2's events. If I had to give it a rating, I'll probably give it 4 out of 5 Jackal Snipers. It's definitely a strike in my book. After First Strike's release, the hype for a particular game with a troubled history would be released a year later, and that game would obviously be Halo 2, which we'll be eventually covering on our next episode.